Hello, good evening everyone. So thank you for being here, for people who joined us tonight in the conference room at the Museo E Rigceca, and for people who is with us tonight online. So thank you everyone for being here. I will be very short because I don't want to take time away to my colleague Johannes Mueller, and I am very happy tonight to introduce his lecture because Johannes joined us, the Museo E Rigceca staff, in 2020, and he already had a long experience. He got his PhD in the Freie Universität in Berlin, and he studied bronze production technology and bronze casting in Bonn and in Munich. And he gave classes in some universities in Germany. But this one is not the only experience that Johannes Mueller brought to the Museo E Rigceca, because he took part also to some excavations in Egypt, with the Austrian excavations in Dahshur and in Elephantine, but he also excavated in Nubia. So his knowledge about history, archaeology, and society of ancient Nubia is part of his baggage that he brought to the Museo E Rigceca experience. And our audience already had the opportunity to meet Johannes Mueller in last month, because he was the curator of a small but interesting temporary exhibition that was hosted in the Museo E Rigceca, and it is part of a series of exhibitions named In the Researcher's Workshop. His exhibition was about cats, falcons, and eels, votive bronzes for animal mummies, from November 2021 up to January 2022. So unfortunately the exhibition just closed, but it was a very interesting example of research, not only about technology and manufacturing of metal objects, but also about their symbolic value, their use in the cult of animals in ancient Egypt. What tonight is very interesting is that the Johannes lecture brings back attention to a very important monument we have in our museum, the rock-cut temple of Ellesija. As you maybe know, we have celebrated 2 years ago the 50th anniversary of the inauguration of the Temple of Ellesija here in Torino, after the temple has been removed from Nubia and transferred to Italy after the building of the Aswan's High Dam. To celebrate this special anniversary, the Museo E Rigceca organized 2 online meetings. One was a kind of virtual visit to the temple with myself and the colleague Beppe Moiso, and the second meeting was with Johannes himself and the colleague Paolo Del Vesco about the relation between Nubia and Egypt in ancient times. So, in the same line, tonight's lecture will be about the Temple of Ellesija in a peculiar aspect that you will see tonight. So, Johannes will help us to discover some interesting details about not only the temple itself, but also about its history. So, I don't want to take time away, and I want to leave the floor to Johannes Mueller and his lecture. After that, if you have any questions, you and the online audience, we will have time for some questions. Thank you very much, and enjoy Johannes' lecture.
Thank you, Ellesija. Thank you, Ellesija, for these very kind words. Dear ladies and gentlemen, as Ellesija already said, the rock-cut chapel of Ellesija is no doubt one of the key monuments of the Museo E Rigceca. It is one of the original Egyptian temples in Nubia rescued from the waters of Lake Nasser in the 1960s. Although well known in terms of its formal decoration and Celtic conception, it still hides some secrets, particularly in terms of the many secondary epigraphical interactions, which will be in the focus of my paper today. But before we go into medias res, I want to say that my paper today is only a work in progress report about one of my personal projects here in Turin. I need to, and I will continue to think about Ellesija and its secondary epigraphy with the future aim of offering a new documentation of the evidence that we're going to discuss. Today, the Ellesija speos is a museum object. Its key object data, including its inventory number, material, date, provenance, and acquisition, can be easily found on our collection online website. The chapel itself was in antiquity also a bit different from other Egyptian temples that we maybe have in our minds. It was not a freestanding town temple. It did not serve a primary religious institution. It was not such an institution for a specific community. Ellesija was a self-contained chapel with permanently installed cult statues in the rear, and it functioned more on an abstract theological level by adding religious meaning to its original location. And in this way, it was visited most probably on a regular basis on certain festival occasions, which were important for the ritual landscape in which it was originally embedded. Thus, let us now shortly review its original location. The Ellesija speos was cut into the Nubian sandstone cliff on the east bank on the Nile, about 224 kilometers south of Aswan, in the heartland of Lower Nubia, which was known as Wawat in Pharaonic times. The chapel itself lies about 10 kilometers north of Aniba. Aniba was the administrative center of the region and the location of the most important religious institution there, the freestanding town temple of Horus, the lord of Aniba. Further significant sites for the regional religious topography are not only Qasr Ibrim in the south, but also the 18th dynasty rock-cut shrines in the cliff of Ibrim facing the Nile, which were dedicated to the main deities of the cataract regions and also Horus of Aniba. The Ellesija speos itself faced west. Its proximity, or its original proximity to the Nile in antiquity is difficult to assess. At least in the 1960s, we know that there was a circa 1.5 kilometer wide riparian strip in front of the chapel, between the chapel and the Nile during low water. The chapel itself was furnished and inaugurated in year 51 of King Thutmose III. Two stela that we will see later today, flanking the doorway, mark this event. The chapel was dedicated to Horus of Aniba on the one side, the deified King Thutmose III, and Satet, the Lady of Seher. It was originally also equipped with a canopy structure covering the courtyard, evidenced by all the rectangular holes that one sees along the upper facade. In the Amarna period, the images and names of Amun and Min were defaced, or in the formal relief decoration, they were erased. Their subsequent restoration took then most likely place under Ramesses II in the 19th dynasty and was most likely supervised by the king's son of Kush, Setau, who we will meet later, who also then introduced Amun as a new cult recipient in altering the identity of the original cult statue of Satet that you see at the back of the temple. In Christian times, the speos was repurposed as an oratory. Engraved crosses and pentagrams attest to this new function, as well as to the deactivation of the old pharaonic imagery. In the subtitle of my paper, I have used the phrase secondary stela and graffiti. So I want to talk about what I mean by that. I understand the term secondary epigraphy, following the definition by Chloe Ragazzoli and others, as inscriptions that do not belong to their medium in its original state, whether built or open, but redefine it. I also use the well-known term graffiti, one of the main constituents of secondary epigraphy. And I understand graffiti as additions, mostly in anthropogenic context, to an already decorated or otherwise modified surface. Furthermore, I understand ancient graffiti as traces of a practice of leaving unsanctioned marks in public built spaces, marking different interrelated issues such as I was here, I own this territory, or I mark spiritual practice and devotion. With regards to the Ellesija speos from Lower Nubia, now in Turin, the term secondary epigraphy can be even employed in a further double sense, since one can identify two levels on which secondary epigraphy is at play. At level 1, secondary epigraphy can be understood as a term circumscribing all added inscriptional and pictorial traces on the original object. So this level can then be split into a number of sub-levels, such as level 1a, the Pharaonic graffiti tableau and rock stela, and level 1b, the Christian crosses and pentagrams that we saw, and 1c, any kind of other further more modern additions. On the other hand, epigraphy is also a term that is used to kind of say or to describe the documentation and study of inscriptions, using different documentation and research methods. And in this way, there is a sub-level 2a also, the epigraphy at Ellesija, at its original place, and the sub-level 2b, the epigraphy of Ellesija in its new location here in Turin. So you see a secondary epigraphy of secondary epigraphy. What I'm thus going to present today is, in a way, a secondary epigraphy of secondary epigraphy. I study the inscriptional traces added to Ellesija in its new context of relocation in the museum, but I use all the available data that was on the one hand gathered by scholars earlier on site, and that is also obviously available here in the reconstructed remains. Let us now shortly review the main available sources we have for the secondary epigraphy of Ellesija. In doing so, we will meet some famous travelers and Egyptologists who visited Ellesija and also documented some of the graffiti. The full list of those scholars who visited Ellesija is much longer. I will only mention them whose documentation is relevant for our topic today. Between 1824 and 38, Robert Hay, a British artist and early Egyptologist, visited the region and made several drawings of the Ellesija chapel. His view of the facade, for instance, shows a number of rock stela, the largest of which is also presented in more detail in another sketch next to the foundation stela of Thutmose III. The view of the interior of the chapel includes a small tableau under the main decoration, and we will see this tableau later again. The documentation of Ellesija by the Prussian expedition to Egypt and Ethiopia, headed by Karl Richard Lepsius, one of the founding fathers of modern Egyptology, was done in 1843 and 1844. It is one of the main references, particularly regarding the secondary inscriptions, which are treated in the relevant text volumes 5, from which you see two relevant pages here. The presence of secondary epigraphy is noted and described, and also when the texts were readable to Lepsius and his team, hand copies are given. As I already said, these descriptions and copies made by the Lepsius expedition still represent one of the most comprehensive data sets about the secondary epigraphy of Ellesija, also in a state pre any kind of water dam influences on the chapel. In the Denkmäler Ergänzungsband, so an additional volume to the original Denkmäler, also one of the small ex-voto tableaus of the king's son Setau is shown. In 1906, in anticipation of the heightening of the old dam at Aswan, Arthur Weigel, a British Egyptologist and author, visited the site while cataloging all extant archaeological monuments along the Nile Valley in Lower Nubia. Among his short description of Ellesija, he also presents his copies of several graffiti, mainly from the southern part of the facade of the chapel. Alan Henderson Gardiner, the famous and prolific British Egyptologist, visited the site a little later in 1908. His notebooks, now kept at the Griffith Institute in Oxford, contain hand copies of the most prominent graffiti, most of which were also already documented by Lepsius and Weigall. And next to the Lepsius documentation that we already have seen, the copies of Gardiner represent the most important and also reliable copies of these texts. However, unfortunately, Gardiner did not record all the graffiti and secondary inscriptions at Ellesija, as also Weigall and Lepsius and the others did. They did not really see them all. Gardiner himself then also admits there were many more and many others, which he did not note in his manuscripts. Now we make a large leap ahead in time. The next documentation project took place 50 years later in anticipation of the final closing of the Aswan High Dam. The Centre de Documentation et d'Études sur l'Ancien Égypte undertook a comprehensive architectural and epigraphic documentation of the chapel in the late summer months of the years 1961 and 63. The results were published by Christian Desroches-Noblecourt, Sergio Donadoni, and Gamal Mukhtar in the book Ellesija I, including archaeological descriptions, and Volume 2 with architectural plans. These volumes also include photos of the graffiti and of tableaux in the interior of the chapel, which were then also used by two scholars that we may meet now, namely Jaroslav Czerny and Abdelaziz Sadek, two scholars that were responsible for the study of all these secondary texts. Because these graffiti and secondary inscriptions were supposed to be published by Jaroslav Czerny and Abdelaziz Sadek in a future volume, Ellesija III, mainly using the copies of Alan Henderson Gardiner. Because those copies, as I already said, were understood as comprehensive and as quality records before any water affected the facade of Ellesija. This volume, Ellesija III, however, has never been published because the death of Jaroslav Czerny in 1970 brought the work to a halt. The photographic record of the Centre de Documentation, some photos that you see here, is, however, still one of the backbones of addressing the topic of secondary inscriptions. In 1966, an official decree of the President of the United Arab Republic officially made the Ellesija Chapel a gift for the government and the people of Italy, since Italy was amongst those countries who substantially helped in the salvage of the Abu Simbel temples. Earlier, in 1962, a first reconnaissance of the site by an Italian team had taken place, which took photos, checked the chapel's condition, and discussed the methods of its potential removal. In 1965, the Italian team, headed by Silvio Curto, arrived at the site to carry out the rescue work with the help of local workmen. The whole inner part of the speos, including parts of the facade bearing some stela and graffiti, was cut in around 66 blocks of roughly 1.1 meters and weighing up to 2 tons. The work was done in around 20 days in 24-hour shifts. In 1966, the blocks were transported to Aswan, where their condition was checked again. And all those stages of the operation are documented by photos which are kept in the archives of the MUSEO E RICERCA. On the 24th of April 1967, the blocks arrived in Turin. In the following 2 years, the inner part of the chapel was reconstructed so that it could be opened to the public in September 1970. Some elements of the facade, particularly the 2 largest stela, were, as you can see here, exhibited standing on the wall next to the speos. 20 years later, in 1991, the whole facade was recreated and the stela and graffiti blocks were included in the display. An epigraphical copy was used during these works to plan the proper rearrangement of the larger blocks of the facade. We will come back to all these elements of the facade later. Speaking of the facade, what is often not known or addressed is the fact that indeed not the whole chapel, including all the elements around it, as well as its facade, was taken to Turin. Only Egyptologically interesting segments were deemed worthy. Obviously, the whole inner wall decoration, including the rock-cut statues, was chosen. In terms of the facade, however, only segments made their way to Turin, such as parts of the north wall, including several stela, the two historical stela of Thutmose III, and parts of the doorway, and larger parts of the adjacent southern facade. Unfortunately, many of the cutout blocks from the facade, or particularly from the facade, bearing graffiti and secondary inscriptions, suffered during the transport. Thus, they arrived in Turin only in fragments, so that also their reconstruction that we just saw was indeed quite a challenge. The reconstructed southern part of the facade looks like that today. Since the space for the Ellesija chapel in the museum space in the room just over there was limited, it is nowadays not exhibited directly next to the chapel, but on an adjacent wall of our Nubian gallery. The small sketch that you see here again shows how this wall, detached wall, relates to the facade of Ellesija that you can see in the Sala Nubiana. And this wall was indeed also the basis for Matilde Borlas, and I'm happy that she's here, for her seminal assessment of all the stela and inscriptions of the Pharaonic period, which was published in Silvio Curto's book about Ellesija in 2010. This indeed pioneering work is the indispensable basis for me for all the studies that I present today. Let us now look at the different spots of secondary epigraphy at Ellesija. Starting in the north, there was this rock face, which was unfortunately neither really mentioned nor documented by earlier scholars. So we have no record of Lepsius or Weigall or Gardiner or anyone about this wall. During the removal works, this rock face was also used as a ramp to access the chapel, which then led to its almost full destruction. Thus, the only record that we have of this wall are indeed a few photos, which also were the basis for Matilde to identify the epigraphical individual remains. There are 7 graffiti and 2 stela. Due to the still okayish but not really high definition photo quality, Matilde Borlas hesitated to read any of the texts. I'm also still pondering about this wall, looking at this photo and all the inscriptions on a repeated basis in order to train my view and come up with new readings. Today I feel confident at least to read graffiti D1 as mentioning a gold worker Mahu, so Nebiu Mahu. And I think next to this, or a little bit under D1, there is also a new graffito which was not originally listed as such, as a signature of another Nebiu, another gold worker called Ken. In addition, some titles are at least discernible, so you'll read here also Wab, priest, and scribe, but the remainder of the inscriptions is still difficult. But what also is interesting are these 2 stela here that are highlighted in green. Since the topic of today's paper is also about visitors to Ellesija, I also attempted to, let's say, create prosopographical lists, so listing the evidence of historical people. The meager result of breaking down the data about the historical people mentioned in this graffiti on this particular wall is shown here. At least 2 new ones, Mahu and Ken, both gold worker, can be added to the prosopographical record of Ellesija. Other visitors to the chapel leaving a graffito at this outer wall can at this moment only be identified by their titles as either scribes or Wab priests. In addition, at least, the iconography of one of the stela that were highlighted here in green can be assessed in more detail. There is a male standing in adoration in front of Horus of Aniba. It is indeed a pity that particularly this wall was ignored by early travelers and scholars, and then also later severely affected during the salvage works, because it would have provided, as you see here, there are quite a number of graffiti, key data on several New Kingdom people from Lower Nubia and their relationship to Ellesija. But there seems to be at least one tiny little reference to this wall. Among the archive material of Jaroslav Czerny, now kept in the Griffith Institute at Oxford, some of these texts might be referred to. But you will see later there is another Nebiu Mahu text, so it could also relate to other graffiti. Jaroslav Czerny, working on the preparation of the Ellesija graffiti manuscript, obviously used an already existing numbering system, so you see these green numbers here, and provides a reading for a number of texts, which I think in most cases relate to this northern outer rock face. Unfortunately, Czerny does not give any info or any more detailed info on the proper location, and there is also no proper concordance about the numbers that he uses to the inscriptions that were earlier published. So this is still a lacuna, but I'm trying to also find the lost manuscript of Czerny in order to, let's say, solve this question. Let's now turn our attention to the northern wall of the courtyard. Lepsius noted the presence of several stela there showing a person in adoration before Amun and Horus, and he stated, so Lepsius, that they were for the most part unreadable. So he says there are next to them also some other unreadable ones. The Centre de Documentation and also the Turin Photo Archive contain images of the three main stela that you see here while they were still in situ, while also some parts of the wall were never properly photographed. So also there is sometimes a lack of documentation. Again, Mathilde Borla was the one who has identified the main epigraphical elements of this wall, which is reconstructed in Turin. There are 4 stela and 4/5 graffiti. Regarding this wall, let us shortly focus on the 3 main stela. Recent photography under normal raking light conditions allows one to discern the major elements. Amun and Horus are the deities represented. Male people appear in adoration in front of them, and there are obviously also remains of text. These 3 rock stela thus follow the typical Ramesside votive stela format and attest to the fact that both Amun and Horus of Aniba were venerated in the chapel in Ramesside times. It would now be very interesting to know who those people were who commissioned these stela, to understand which people do we see here. Let's see whether we can do this. Several weeks ago, our photographers, Nicola Dell'Aquila and Federico Taverni, undertook RTI photography on these stela. So RTI means reflectance transformation imaging. The results are promising. Some features, such as the identifying labels accompanying the deities, appear much clearer. So here one can easily read Hor Neb Miam, so for all the Egyptologists in the audience. However, despite the RTI data, most of the text as such, the hieroglyphic signs, still remain unclear. Only a number of individual signs can be identified. Since these texts also seem to follow or should follow the usual formats of these Ramesside votive stela texts, so maybe having offering or praise formula, it should be doable to reconstruct some of the texts. Possibly also a name, Nefer, could be read. But at this moment, again, I need to highlight the fact that what we're looking at here is indeed a work in progress. Since those stela, obviously also to Lepsius, to Czerny, and to other people already posed a challenge in like understanding and reading and deciphering, so to say, the traces. So I also need to continue thinking about them. But I hope that sometime in the future I might also be able to provide something like a proper epigraphical copy, bearing in mind that this is only a copy of those stela in their secondary state of relocation here in Turin. So the chance to do this on site is unfortunately lost. For this wall, the breakdown of prosopographical data is also rather scanty. There are still too many question marks. Further thinking about the stela on this wall in particular will, as I said, hopefully fill some of these gaps. In view of the other wall we have just seen, where at least 2 gold workers appeared next to some scribes and priests, we here have at least a graffiti of an overseer of priests and an overseer of craftsmen called Bag and Werrell. He is known from a tomb of Aniba, so the nearby central place in Lower Nubia. So he is one of the people that we are talking about today, providing a first clue as to where all those visitors, those ancient visitors to Ellesija, originally came from. We now shortly turn to the northern side of the facade, which does not really fall into our secondary epigraphy topic. But the comparison of the present state of this so-called endowment stela of Thutmose III that you see on the left with its conditions in the 1960s, so the black and white photograph in the upper right, aims at making us aware of the rather difficult condition of the facade reconstructed here in Turin. The frailty of the sandstone, its erosion, cutting, transport, and reconstruction obviously had a worsening impact on its condition. And this again underlines that any modern epigraphical work at Ellesija is only a secondary epigraphy documenting also the secondary condition of the speos here in Turin. But let's now turn to the entrance to the chapel. The graffiti on the northern walls were seemingly only noted by Lepsios, who calls them unreadable and thus provides no copies. In the 1960s, both walls were photographed, and it seems that also Jaroslav Czerny started to read them. But in the archive in the Griffith Institute, I could not really relate the traces that we see here with any of the Czerny manuscript entries. An additional problem, we are also faced with an additional problem here. Only parts of those walls were reconstructed in Turin. There are indeed now larger parts missing. Based on the Centre de Documentation, a photo on the left, which shows these graffiti from my taste quite clearly, also the black and white and the contrast is quite nice, I again feel confident to read several new graffiti so that they were never listed or mentioned in any earlier publication. So there is a new scribe, Pia. There's again a certain person called Mahu, which could be the same gold worker that we just met on the other wall. There is a scribe, Imen something, and a chief of gold workers, Neb Merut F, potentially. The traces below that you see, under Neb Merut F, there are some things. They, for the moment, escape a coherent reading on my part. The opposite wall of the entrance presents a graffito that was noted by Lepsios, Weigall, and Gardiner. It is the signature of the mayor of Aniba, the Hatia in Miam, called Mes, or Mose. During the removal of the chapel, the cutting of the blocks, this block was cut in a way that the graffito was bisected, and only the right part was brought to Turin and reconstructed. In addition, a part of this block originally bearing parts of this graffito is now missing, so this little blue triangle did not make it to Turin. Thus, the graffito of the mayor of Aniba called Mes is nowadays only preserved in a very fragmentary state. Furthermore, there seemed to be another graffito below, but these signs were on the one hand overwritten by the crosses and are therefore also, for me, still difficult to identify. Anyway, the prosopographical breakdown of these two walls flanking the doorway is more, let's say, positive since it contains at least 4 new people. They are highlighted in gray here. And they are new in the sense that they do not appear in any of the earlier published works on Ellesija. So I still need to double check the Czerny manuscript, and maybe when I found his original preparation for the publication, there will be references. But for the moment, they have never been, let's say, mentioned in the literature. Interestingly, we again see scribes and gold worker, so 2 professional groups that we already met at the northern outer wall. And the person of Mes or Mose, the mayor of Aniba, now offers another clue as to where those people all came from. It is highly likely that their hometown and workplace was Aniba, and that they came to visit the Ellesija chapel either on professional duty or for ritual purposes. The best documented part of Ellesija is obviously its interior. This was the main Egyptological interest. However, also the interior includes a number of secondary inscriptions. There are 2 tableaux of the king's son of Kush, Setau, on either side of the Stela under the main decoration. There is a very small graffito line of the high priest of Horus of Aniba called Sebachau on the northern Stela wall. There's a further graffito in the first room that was understood earlier as a single text mentioning a certain Wab priest Hui, son of the overseer of craftsmen Raka, son of the temple scribe Ahmose. However, a closer look at the original wall has confirmed what others have already guessed. This strange bird in the copy of Czerny is a phantom. It's not there. Czerny obviously made this drawing on the basis of a photo, and the photo shows these cracks in the wall, so he thought there might be a little Tsar bird in order to create this threefold genealogy. But one can go to the actual wall and check this is not there. Also, the spacing of the, let's say, signs in these 3 columns is different, which does support the idea that this inscription indeed needs to be understood as 2 separate graffiti mentioning 2 different people, so we can't use this for also genealogical purposes to create a family tree mentioning all those 3 people. Anyway, these are details. Let's again focus on the prosopographical dossier of the, from the interior of the chapel. You see the list here. We discussed them already, and all those people are most likely connected with one particular project, namely the restoration of the reliefs and cult images after their partly destruction in the Amarna period. I already mentioned this. This restoration probably took place under Rameses II and was supervised by the viceroy of Nubia, Setau. So this viceroy and his team of priests, scribes, and craftspeople then also left different marks in the chapel to commemorate their participation in this project. They used different formats at different spaces, which I think are most likely related also to their social status and their functional roles. Interestingly, also 2 of them clearly again come from Aniba. So there is the high priest of Horus of Aniba called Sebachau, and also the Wab priest Hui. Setau thus drafted his team of specialists and priests from this central place Aniba in Lower Nubia. And the other graffiti of scribes and craftsmen from the outer parts of the chapel, which are also tentatively dated into the Ramesside period, and particularly under Rameses III, also most likely relate to this project of restoration and cultic reactivation of the chapel. Not related to our secondary epigraphy topic in a direct sense is again the largest stela on the chapel's facade. However, I want to shortly talk about this in order to provide an overview of the whole chapel. As a historical monument, the so-called foundation stela of Thutmose III has gained the most attention on the part of scholars. The Lepsius copy, in comparison to the 1960s photographs, and also the current state, showcases its different stages of preservations, and again highlights the fact that when we look at the Ellesija facade now and do epigraphical work, we do this with Ellesija in the secondary context of relocation and also with certain effects on the condition of the stone. But now we go further, and this again touches upon our key topic. The next stela, this rock-cut stela here, is immediately to the right of the one just seen. It shows Ramesses II in adoration of Amun and Horus of Aniba. It was added to the facade under the viceroy of Nubia Setau, who we just have met inside the chapel, and who we see here also kneeling in adoration below the main register. This most formal monument within Ellesija's secondary epigraphy is also most likely linked to the restoration and cultic reactivation of the chapel. As a quasi-royal stela, it was placed in the immediate vicinity to the stela of King Thutmose III. It commemorates that the restoration project supervised by the Viceroy Setau on behalf of the king. At least parts of the lower text were copied by Lepsius and Gardiner. During the removal of the facade, this stela was broken in two parts, which one can also now see in the reconstructed state here in Turin. One graffito that was unfortunately not really noticed, or that went unnoticed by almost all scholars in the past, can be found, or was to be found, above the entrance. The graffito was only seen by Richard Lepsius, who describes it as a long hieratic inscription dated from the 20th year of Ramesses III. On 1960s photos, two lines of text are in fact visible, which were, however, never recorded in any more detail. So neither Gardiner, nor Czerny, nor the Centre de Documentation obviously noticed this text, while Mathilde did. Some individual signs of the text can be identified, but I, as well as other scholars, are not able to provide a coherent reading. Today, also, at least a little part of this text is still preserved, which can be seen at the uppermost left corner of the large stela of Thutmose III. Nevertheless, this inscription, if it indeed dates to Ramesses III, provides also evidence of a visit of an unknown official to Ellesija during the reign of this 20th dynasty king. We now go further and look at the southern part of the facade. The area highlighted here is the largest zone with graffiti, adjacent to the just seen stela of Ramesses II and the Viceroy Setau. Many of the parts that were removed got fragmented on their way to Turin. You've seen some of the photos already. And the reconstruction that we see here in Turin was based on the epigraphical copy that seems to have been created by either a member of the Italian mission or by someone of the Centre de Documentation, possibly, I hope, directly on site. This epigraphical copy would be then the most direct and also the best epigraphical copy. Until now, however, I and also others were unsuccessful to locate these tracings. So if anyone amongst the visitors or the audience has an idea where these plastic foils with epigraphical copies of the southern part of the facade of Ellesija are, please let me know. I would be happy for any indications as to where they could be. Today, you've seen this photo already. This wall is detached from the chapel and exhibited along the northern wall of our Nubian gallery. This reconstruction, done in the 1990s, uses all available blocks and fragments. The missing areas and gaps were filled with sandstone-colored paste, while some signs along the breaks were also redrawn. A visually amazing result was achieved, which has, however, also a number of flaws regarding a realistic original representation of this wall. Therefore, this part of the wall and its graffiti need to be taken with a grain of salt in the reconstructed state, again highlighting this secondary epigraphy issue that I highlighted already. In terms of earlier documentation regarding this wall, it was unfortunately also only very randomly photographed. Obviously also because the lighting condition at the western-facing facade of Ellesija are difficult. A few images of this wall at least exist, but most of them have a rather bad lighting quality, and also they are not, let's say, high definition. On the other hand, this is also the wall that was at least most intensely documented on the part of earlier scholars, namely Lepsius, Weigall, and Gardiner. What I tried here very randomly, there's lots of lines going on, I have tried to mark the individual graffiti or graffiti groups and connect them with their earlier documentation. On the one hand, one can spot several reading differences, so not all the scholars read the text in the same way. On the other hand, it's also apparent that some texts, particularly on the right, so the southernmost part, were only recorded by Lepsius. So again, Weigall and Gardiner did not note all the remaining texts. I'm not going to discuss all the differences in reading today. This is not our topic, because the following slide aims at presenting you with my current readings of those texts. In doing so, I also follow the model of Mathilde Borla, who more or less did the same also for this wall. Here I have superimposed hieroglyphic renderings of the graffiti to the image. This is also only meant as a preliminary way for my own understanding of this wall in terms of the location, distribution, size, orientation of the text. I again need to think further about also the sequence and chronology of the graffiti, which is then also based on prosopographical discussions of the owners, but this is still an ongoing issue. What I plan to do in the future is to do an epigraphical copy of this wall, obviously having in mind that this is a secondary representation of the wall, so it would not be able to provide the original state of the wall, but nevertheless, this will then also be the moment to discuss the different styles, so writing styles of the graffiti. There are semi-hieratic and also almost monumental hieroglyphic signs present, as well as the different sizes of the text and their location. So the question is really, do they tell us something about the makers or the owners or beneficiaries of these texts? If we look now at the prosopographical breakdown of this wall, then we see this is, in comparison to all the others, quite large. Besides the king's son Setau, a number of people belonging to the administration of Nubia appear next to local administrators and priests of the Horus Temple of Aniba. The dating in the table follows the initial assessment by Mathilde Borla and also others, dating most of them to the time of Ramesses II. And indeed, some people are also quite well known already, indeed then also predating the time of Ramesses II, including the deputy of Kush, Amenemope, who appears here with those large three-lined graffito. He is known to have been buried at Soleb, so in Upper Nubia, and he also seems to appear anonymously in the tomb TT40, so the tomb of the viceroy of Nubia called Hui, who was viceroy under Tutankhamun. So Amenemope is also an interesting case among those people who left the graffito, since his presence at Ellesija dates to shortly after the Amarna period. While the restoration and re-inauguration of the chapel was mostly ascribed to Viceroy Setau under Ramesses II, the deputy of Kush, Amenemope, could also have been tasked with it. If this were not the case, his presence at the chapel might have been motivated by an inspection of the chapel or by a stopover on one of his professional travels. In the Ellesija photo archive, there are also some photos of texts which we can't really relate or which we can't really locate within the facade topography of Ellesija. And there are also some new texts, but I'm not going to further discuss them. What I want to do now is summing up, because time is has already progressed. So after this review of all the available historical sources and the actual traces or remains of the secondary epigraphy at Ellesija, I hope I, on the one hand, could acquaint you with all the challenges one is faced with studying the graffiti and secondary stela at the monument itself here in Turin. But the identification of new texts and also the establishing of their reading is only one part of the medal. The local setting of the graffiti must also be assessed in more detail in order to understand the motivations of the ancient Egyptians to leave such a mark, and also to understand their experiences connected with doing so and being present at the site. So we also need to think about Ellesija in a different way than we are used to looking at the remains and all the black and white photographs. The row of holes along the upper facade is evidence for an original wooden structure, like a canopy that covered the forecourt. Since also at the twin chapel of Jebel Dosha there are these holes, it's proof that this was indeed an original New Kingdom structure. And this structure then also triggers questions not only in terms of its presence during the whole New Kingdom, and also how this presence then affected the location choices of the graffiti under this canopy and in this courtyard space. Because all the graffiti can be found under these holes, and if we think that the canopy really covered the whole courtyard, then this shading canopy definitely affected not only the making of the graffiti, but also their visibility and also their visual impact, because they were then under the shade of the courtyard or under the shading of the canopy. Another thing that can be discussed is then also, given the fact that these stela were made, or these graffiti were then made under a shaded, in a shaded courtyard, maybe the rock surface, when they were made, was still fresh when those stela and graffiti were incised. So all the newly cut graffiti into the wall that were done in Ramesside times would probably potentially also stand out from the rock face. Another question follows also is, were those graffiti and stela painted, or was there any color used to highlight them? Indeed, there is evidence for colored rock inscriptions from the First Cataract and elsewhere, which supports this idea. Traces of color have also been mentioned for the inner reliefs of Ellesija, and also Lepsius mentioned some traces for the outer graffiti, particularly the large inscription of Ramesses III. We thus need to imagine the chapel and also its secondary epigraphy in a different way under the canopy, and also maybe in a more colorful and more visually impactful way than our current state of the chapel suggests. Further questions of who exactly made the graffiti and stela also need to be asked. So were the simple line text indeed individual signatures of the people who are mentioned? Did the deputy of Kush Amenemope, the mayor of Aniba Mes, or the temple scribe Ahmose make them with their own hands? Or were the graffiti created by, or particularly the stela then, created by brought-in specialists coming here with all their toolkit to execute the ordered inscription on behalf of the beneficiaries? The stela of Ramesses II and his viceroy Setau, as well as the smaller votive stela that we saw, were in all likelihood made by specialists who knew the appropriate layout, texts, and iconography. Furthermore, before we end in a few minutes, look at the distribution of the individual forms of secondary epigraphy on the facade might be instructive. The rectangular stela of Setau clearly seeks a location close to the earlier royal stela. The Ramesside votive stela, marked in green, all cluster along the northern outer walls of the forecourt. All the other more simpler epigraphical formats are found in general in 4 larger spots. So there is one larger cluster on the northern wall, there is a smaller group around the 3 votive stela, there is a smaller cluster along the sides of the doorway, and then the largest concentration on the southern facade. The inscription dating to Ramesses III over the entrance again seeks proximity to the earlier royal monuments and seems to, let's say, mark the entrance. What is most striking in this regard, looking at my try here to visualize a little bit their distribution, is maybe the grouping of the votive stela along the northern part. Was this the result of a better visibility under or outside of the canopy, or was this the appropriate location for putting these stela in relation to the, let's say, ritual space of Ellesija? These are questions that one needs to address, and that I will in the future. I'm now summing up. The graffiti, tableau, and stela we have seen are different forms of secondary epigraphical practice. Each format had its own significance and also social setting. The stela of Setau on the facade showing Ramesses II is the most formal elite monument. Its location and iconography clearly attest to his status and role. The form of a tableau with a person in adoration of the deities inside the chapel was also only reserved for Setau, the viceroy, so no one else uses this format. The other members of his team, so all the gold workers, scribes, and priests, then commemorated their presence and involvement in this restoration and reactivation of the chapel project in simpler graffiti, both inside and outside of the chapel. Earlier, later 18th dynasty visitors to the chapel, such as the deputy of Kush, Amenemope, mainly used the larger graffiti wall in the south to leave their marks. And in this way, all the graffiti act as means to inscribe their makers or beneficiaries into the social space as well as the ritual matrix of the chapel. The votive stela in the north are again a more elaborate means and format of inscribing their owners into the local festive and cultic environment. We still know nothing about their owners, but it might be safe to say that they belong to the upper social echelons of New Kingdom Nubia, and probably they were also coming from nearby Aniba. The presence of the chapel built by Thutmose III and its local role as destination of locally important festivals or as place of restoration works, so these two contexts of going there can be discussed, attracted several epigraphical interactions, several secondary epigraphical interactions, which initiated and also maintained a dialogue within the monument and its meaning, as well as amongst themselves. So also these texts and the stela seem to, let's say, not really talk to each other, but there are certain relationships. Leaving such marks in different formats, I think most likely also depending on the social status of their owners/beneficiaries, was a socially accepted and common practice in Pharaonic Egypt, a part of the so-called epigraphic habit or epigraphic culture of Pharaonic Egypt. The presence of someone at the speos might have been mainly intentional, with the aim to visit a chapel or to do work there, but also a more unintentional presence is conceivable, so passing by the chapel, spending some time there, and using this time to leave a mark. The tableaux and stela showing a person in adoration of the local gods are then also key evidence that in general corroborate the ritual framework for the intentional presence of people at Ellesija. I hope my short, or rather long, work in progress report could offer you some insights on Ellesija, while highlighting also all the challenges one is faced with doing secondary epigraphy, sensu study of inscriptions, of secondary epigraphy, sensu edit ancient texts and images at the Speos here in Turin. I want to end with a wonderful photo showing one of the workers responsible for the reconstruction of the chapel in Turin taking a well-deserved break during his hard work. You now also have earned your free evening. Thank you for your patience and attention.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for this very clear and, how to say, not only clear, but it is a very effective presentation about the work, the hard work you're carrying out in the Museo Egizio, because it is something very unusual to see all the stages of a research, so starting from sources, the method that you shared with us tonight, and the results you are underlining now. So if you have any questions from the audience, of course, we are at your disposal. No one? Yes, Paolo Del Vesco. Please, maybe, do we have a microphone for, oh, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Johannes, for this wonderful presentation. I just wanted to ask you, have you tried or will you try to track some of the less known people of the graffiti in the documentation from Aniba itself? And the second, I spotted in one of your prosopographic tableau the name of a songstress. How common or uncommon is to find a graffito of a songstress?
Well, regarding the first question, as you know, the prosopography of particularly Upper Nubia, but also Lower Nubia is one of my key research interests. So I have published extensively on the prosopography of Amar West, Soleb, and Sai in the New Kingdom. And in this regard, I also have a whole data set of Aniba, but interestingly, only a few people that we also know from Aniba, that they were buried there, or that we have any kind of inscription that remains, also are present at Ellesija. So, and we also need to think that we know that Aniba was a center also for gold working and for craftsmanship, so based on also the titles of those people buried at Aniba. But the tombs of gold workers and Wab priests and scribes, we have a few from Aniba, but other people at Aniba leave or have left a larger epigraphical impact in the cemetery. So it's still difficult to track those people in other prosopographical or based on other prosopographical evidence. So I think that some of those people appearing here at Ellesija, so that their graffito at Ellesija is their only record along the Nubian Nile Valley. What I also did in another earlier publication is thinking about the rock inscription landscape, and also the rock inscriptions are one key archaeological monument or evidence in order to understand, to identify people living, working, traveling in ancient Nubia. but also those people that are present at Ellesija, so the gold worker and the scribes and priests, don't really appear anywhere else in Lower Nubia based on the rock inscription evidence. At least as we see the Idenu and Kash Amenemopet, who is buried at Soleb, so in Upper Nubia, appears here, so that's quite interesting. Then also obviously a person like Setau can be traced all over Egypt, so he's an amazing case to study territoriality and where those people went and where they worked and where they came from. But also regarding your question of the songstress, this is something they don't indeed really appear in the rock inscription record. And let's say consider Ellesija as being part of this, using the ancient ancient Nubian Nile Valley as a rock inscription landscape. There are not really songstresses, which again would then potentially give more power to the fact that the visit of the songstress to Ellesija might have been in the context of a festival procession or a ritual. But it's a good thing to, a good idea to kind of, I will go through my prosopographical database of Nubia in order to see if we have songstresses in other, let's say, rock inscription or graffiti contexts. But I, for the moment, doubt it, but I need to check. Yeah.
Maybe Dr. Poole has one?
Right, okay, so this was, I'm impressed at how you managed to condense so much information in this compact format. It was really interesting. My question is actually a generic one. It's you mentioned that the visitors to the chapel would have been representative of the local elite, basically. And I was wondering at the fact that within this local elite, there are people people featured who worked with their hands, craftsmen, Nebiu, most notably, and so I was wondering what kind of questions this raises in terms of the literacy of these social groups, or some people call them sub-elites, social cores. There in Medina comes to mind people who have access to the means of expression of the true elites without being members thereof themselves.
This is a question I have not yet properly thought about, using or thinking about the graffiti at Ellesija in terms of literacy. I mean, obviously for people like the deputy of Kush and scribes and Setau, literacy is not an issue. Obviously, as we see here, people like gold workers, if these texts were made by themselves, most likely, they have at least an understanding of their title and their name. I mean, it also depends on which level we put literacy, but writing his own title and name is maybe something that was also a common practice. What we also know is that indeed gold worker in Nubia also played important roles, and there is one famous tomb 26 on Sai Island of a gold worker that really shows that Mose, his owner, belonged to the upper social echelon of the town of Sai in the New Kingdom, which then again attests to their rather raised status within these communities, which then would also properly lead to their ability to properly read and write.
If there is no question more, I have one. about the future of your research, because you mentioned, of course, that research never stops. So what are next steps about your study of rock cut graffiti?
I mean, on the one hand, everything that I talked about today needs to be cast into a scholarly article that is in preparation. But a wonderful thing is also that our museum plans for the anniversary in 2024, during which then also the Ellesija temple will play a different role. So the room of Ellesija will be open to the public, and then we are, as curators, thinking of a new display of the temple, a new presentation of its ancient modern context, of its way to Turin, and of its meaning in its original landscape, and also to address the impact that also the Sadalali, the Haidem at Aswan, and the flooding of the Nile Valley had on this traditional cultural landscape of Nubia. So all this research, very detailed Egyptological research, will in different ways and forms then also materialize in the new presentation of the Ellesija temple for 2024.
The online audience is congratulating with Dr. Owen Mueller for his lecture tonight. And so next step would be 2024. So thank you very much for being here tonight. Grazie a tutti, buona serata. Ai prossimi risultati degli studi di oggi.